Buried behind the silk curtains of China's imperial palaces was a secret so brutal it destroyed thousands of lives. These women were not chosen for love, but for power, trapped in a golden cage where every smile could mean death. To outsiders, they seemed blessed with silks and jewels, but in truth they were prisoners of fear, silence and cruelty. Poisonings, disappearances and punishments lurked in every shadow, while emperors used their divine power to control their bodies and erase their voices. This is not a story of beauty. It is the forgotten nightmare of women whose suffering was buried beneath the glitter of imperial glory. This is the secret the empire never wanted you to hear. The Forbidden City was not simply a palace. It was a universe of its own, designed to inspire awe and fear in equal measure. Rising above the heart of Beijing, its colossal walls of blood-red brick enclosed nearly 8,000 rooms, a labyrinth where power was absolute and secrets were buried deeper than the foundations themselves. To the common people who gathered at its gates, the sight of golden roofs shimmering beneath the sun seemed to confirm the emperor's divinity. Every painted dragon, every carved phoenix, every polished stone pathway whispered of eternal glory. Yet behind the walls, the very grandeur that symbolized heavenly order masked a reality far more suffocating. The heart of this world lay within the inner courts, the harem. Officially, it was a place of refinement, where the empire's most beautiful women lived in harmony under the protection of the Son of Heaven. Outsiders spoke of jeweled robes, fragrant gardens, and lanterns that never burned out. They imagined music drifting through corridors, laughter echoing from moonlit balconies, and concubines strolling among blossoms with faces untouched by sorrow. But this illusion was crafted with precision. Every brushstroke in the murals, every carefully maintained garden path, and every public procession of silken robes existed to project perfection. The truth was hidden behind carved doors and silken curtains where the walls themselves seemed to drink in the women's cries. To step into the harem was to step into a prison disguised as paradise. Once the heavy gates closed behind a girl, she ceased to belong to the world outside. Her family name faded, her past dissolved, and her identity was reduced to a rank in a rigid hierarchy designed to control. The hall smelled not only of sandalwood incense, but also of fear, a scent that clung to every surface and never faded. Rituals structured each day. The women rose before dawn, bathed, dressed in assigned garments, and waited for orders. They were forbidden from wandering freely, forbidden from speaking without permission, forbidden from making choices of their own. Freedom, once lost, could never be reclaimed. The architecture itself reflected the system's cruelty. The harem was a maze of courtyards and chambers, each assigned to women of specific ranks. High walls blocked the view of the city outside, and even the sky seemed smaller, framed by roofs that pressed down like gilded cages. Servants and guards moved silently, their eyes always watchful, their loyalties uncertain. Whispers traveled, faster than footsteps, and the wrong word could destroy a woman's life. Though the palace glittered with lacquer and jade, its true essence was control. Every step, every gesture, every breath weighed against invisible scales of obedience. To those born beyond its walls, the Forbidden City appeared eternal and unchanging, a masterpiece of order. To those trapped inside, it was a machine that consumed lives. Its rituals preserved the emperor's power, but they also erased individuality, turning women into shadows. And in this silence, in this endless cycle of rituals and fear, lay the seeds of stories so cruel that history itself sought to bury them. Every morning in the harem began not with the rising of the sun, but with the striking of gongs. The sound echoed through endless courtyards, metallic and hollow, pulling women from restless sleep into another day of ritualized submission. Servants entered chambers with lowered eyes, presenting trays of robes embroidered with dragons, phoenixes, and peonies, symbols of status that carried more weight than the women themselves. A robe of pale silk might elevate one's position for the day. A robe of dull fabric could be a silent punishment. Even in clothing, the system reminded them that their worth was not their own, but granted or taken by powers they could not control. Meals followed strict rules. At dawn, bowls of rice porridge, pickled vegetables and tea were served in near silence. Women of lower rank ate quickly, heads bowed, forbidden from speaking unless addressed. Higher-ranked consorts dined in more elaborate chambers, where porcelain bowls overflowed with delicacies from across the empire: lotus root stews, duck roasted with plums, fish steamed in ginger and wine. Yet abundance was not safety. Every dish was first tested by eunuchs, who tasted carefully, watched for signs of poisoning and sometimes collapsed before their mistress's eyes. Food which in the outside world meant life and comfort here carried the constant threat of death. The emperor's presence determined everything. If he was expected to visit, the air grew taut with fear. Women spent hours in preparation: skin whitened with powder, hair arranged with jade pins, robes adjusted until every fold appeared flawless. Yet beauty was never enough. A smile too eager, a gaze too bold, even the faintest tremor in a hand could be judged as disrespect. The emperor's glance might grant years of privilege, or it might condemn a woman to lifelong obscurity, hidden in some forgotten chamber until her youth withered away. His silence was as dangerous as his words, for both could shape destinies. But danger did not come only from above. Rivalries within the harem bred an atmosphere more poisonous than any herb hidden in a teacup. Every woman sought survival, and in a place where one person's rise meant another's fall, alliances shifted like shadows. A misplaced compliment could be twisted into treachery. A gift of embroidered silk might carry whispers of bribery. Even family connections could not protect forever. A daughter of nobility might find herself stripped of favor if another woman, armed with cunning or cruelty, captured the emperor's fleeting attention. The walls did not simply contain women, they turned them into adversaries, each fighting. A silent war where weapons were smiles, rumors, and secrets. Despite the constant struggle, the harem maintained the illusion of harmony for the world outside. On festival days, the women appeared in glittering processions, their faces serene, their robes glowing beneath lantern light. Foreign envoys marveled at the sight, convinced that these women lived lives of divine luxury. They did not see the hidden bruises, the silent tears, the terror that waited behind closed doors. To the empire, the harem was a jewel, its perfection, proof of heavenly order. To the women inside, it was a mask hiding endless despair. And so, as the seasons turned and dynasties rose and fell, the harem endured. It absorbed thousands of lives, each reduced to whispers and forgotten names. Some adapted, some resisted, and some disappeared, their fates sealed in silence. The palace swallowed them all, preserving only the emperor's power while erasing the humanity of those who lived and died unseen. The Forbidden City's design was no accident. Every stone, every gate, every chamber reinforced hierarchy and submission. The outer courts belonged to men, ministries, guards, and officials who busied themselves with the empire's affairs. But beyond carved gates lay the inner sanctum, a world reserved for the emperor and his women. Here, space itself was a weapon of control. Paths bent and twisted, walls rose high enough to block the horizon, and windows were set deliberately, narrow, reminding every occupant that the world outside was no longer theirs. Even the gardens, with their ponds of lotus and bridges arched like rainbows, carried an undertone of captivity. The beauty of the place mocked its prisoners, whispering promises of paradise while tightening the cage around them. Daylight did not bring relief. In the morning, sunlight spilled across tiled roofs, scattering into courtyards where women stood in silence. The brightness exposed their isolation, casting shadows that stretched like bars across the ground. At night, lanterns glowed in calculated patterns, their flickering light guiding guards and eunuchs who patrolled with watchful eyes. There was no true darkness, no true solitude, only the endless awareness of being observed. Privacy was a privilege the harem never granted. Every breath could be overheard, every step reported. To live in such a place was to live under constant surveillance, one's humanity stripped away by the weight of scrutiny. And yet, despite the suffocating structure, the empire celebrated this system as divine. Officials praised the emperor's wisdom in maintaining order. Poets composed verses about the beauty of palace women, and common people dreamed of glimpsing even a corner of their silken sleeves. What outsiders worshipped as perfection was in truth a machine that consumed lives. For the women within, each day began in fear and ended in silence, as dreams of freedom withered like petals pressed between the pages of history. This was the true face of the harem, not the glittering jewel admired by the empire, but a golden prison that demanded obedience, thrived on secrecy, and fed on human suffering. The palace that looked eternal was, in fact, a graveyard for countless forgotten souls. And as one season bled into another, the cycle of entrapment began anew. Fresh girls drawn into the maze, their lives stripped bare, their fates sealed the preus. Moment the palace gates closed behind them. The road into the harem began long before its gates. Across the vast empire, in villages tucked between rice fields and in noble mansions lined with carved beams, the emperor's agents searched for beauty. Every few years, an imperial decree summoned families to present their daughters, no matter their rank or circumstance. For the wealthy it was an opportunity to gain favor. For the poor it was a command they could not refuse. No one argued with the will of heaven, even when it meant surrendering their child to a fate from which she might never return. The process was deliberate and merciless. Officials traveled with lists and standards, measuring the angle of a girl's brow, the clarity of her skin, the refinement of her posture. They asked her to walk, to bow, to pour tea, judging every motion with eyes colder than steel. It mattered little whether she had dreams, whether she loved, whether her family depended on her presence. What mattered was whether her face could adorn the emperor's court, whether her body could be woven into the grand tapestry of imperial power. A girl who failed to meet their expectations might be dismissed in shame. One who succeeded would vanish into the palace, never again to belong to herself. For the chosen, farewells were swift and brutal. Families wept, but their tears were powerless against imperial command. Some fathers swelled with pride, imagining their daughter's beauty securing a future for the clan. Others broke silently, knowing they had offered their child not to fortune, but to a gilded prison. Mothers clutched their daughters one last time, whispering warnings or blessings, yet aware that both would soon be forgotten behind the high walls. No matter how cherished a girl had been in her home, the moment she was selected, she became the property of the empire. Once inside the palace gates, the transformation began. The first step was erasure. Names which had carried the weight of ancestry were stripped away. In their place, titles and ranks were assigned: Lady of Virtue, Lady of Grace, Noble Consort. These were not identities but labels, reducing women to roles in a rigid hierarchy. A girl who once ran through fields or laughed with siblings became an ornament. Her individuality dissolved beneath silken robes. Even her speech changed. She was taught to refer to herself with humility, to speak of the emperor with words that erased her own existence. Her body, too, was no longer hers. Palace attendants inspected her from head to toe, searching for flaws, recording her monthly cycles, cataloguing every detail as though she were livestock. She was trained in posture, in music, in the art of keeping her eyes lowered at the correct angle. Every skill was designed not to enrich her life, but to shape her into a tool of obedience. Even the food she ate and the way she slept were dictated by palace regulations, narrowing her world until only submission remained. The cruelty of the system lay in its deception. Families outside believed their daughters had ascended to paradise, imagining her draped in jewels, surrounded by luxury. They never saw the truth, that the jewels were chains, that the silks weighed like shackles, and that the girl who once bore their name had been transformed into a shadow among shadows. The harem did not welcome women. It consumed them one by one until nothing of their past selves remained. Life inside the harem was a constant performance, every moment dictated by invisible rules that weighed heavier than iron. Women awoke, before dawn, to the chiming of bells, their chambers already filled with the scent of burning incense. Servants arrived to arrange their hair, apply powders, and dress them in robes chosen according to rank. No one dressed herself, no one chose her colors, no one decided whether her hair would be pinned with jade or left plain. Even the smallest detail was a reflection of status, a reminder of where she stood in a hierarchy that stretched like an endless ladder, each rung sharper than the last. At the top of this structure stood the Empress, the official wife of the Emperor, a woman who outwardly embodied dignity and harmony. Beneath her were noble consorts, concubines, attendants, and finally the lowest ranks, girls who were barely acknowledged, yet who bore the same burdens of silence and fear. Promotion was rare, demotion common. A careless word could undo years of patience. Favor could vanish in a single night, and every woman knew that her rise meant another's downfall, for the harem was a zero-sum game in which survival depended on someone else's ruin. The routines seemed ordinary, but each carried hidden peril. A walk through the gardens could end in whispered slander. A gift of fruit could conceal poison. A glance exchanged in the wrong corridor might spark rumors of disloyalty. Trust was nearly impossible, for even friends could turn to rivals when the emperor's attention shifted. Jealousy was more dangerous than swords, and betrayal more common than loyalty. The women learned to smile while plotting, to bow while seething, to survive while slowly being consumed. Punishment lurked in every shadow. A woman who laughed too loudly, who dressed too brightly, or who failed to bow at the precise angle might vanish without warning. Sometimes her chamber was sealed, her possessions removed, her name struck from records. Servants whispered of exiles to cold remote palaces, of silent poisonings disguised as illness, of bodies buried beneath the very courtyards where lanterns still glowed at night. Fear was the emperor's unspoken law, and it seeped into every gesture, every word, every breath. The eunuchs, men stripped of their manhood and bound to the palace forever, were both protectors and predators. They carried messages, enforced discipline, and reported whispers. Some were loyal, many were corrupt. A gift of silver might secure their silence, but betrayal always lingered close. To cross one eunuch could mean disgrace, to offend another could mean death. Their eyes watched from corners, their hands moved unseen, and their tongues carried secrets straight to the throne. And yet, amidst the fear, there were moments of haunting stillness. Women walked beneath moonlit pavilions, their robes trailing, like shadows, their faces unreadable. Musicians played melancholy tunes that drifted across lotus ponds, echoing like the cries of ghosts. Lanterns swayed in the night air, casting trembling patterns on walls that had witnessed centuries of sorrow. The palace was alive, but not with joy, with the weight of history, with voices silenced long ago, with suffering carefully hidden beneath layers of gold. To survive the harem was not to live. It was to surrender piece by piece, until nothing of the girl who had once stepped through the gates remained. Dreams of freedom faded, replaced by the daily struggle to endure another sunrise. And in this world of silence and shadows, cruelty became routine, and despair became eternal. This was the reality buried beneath the empire's glittering mask, a paradise that was never paradise at all, but a prison built on obedience, rivalry, and fear. The harem did not simply claim the bodies of its women, it consumed their identities, their futures, their very souls. And as another generation of girls entered its gates, the cycle of entrapment began again, sealing their fates long before history ever remembered their names. The harem was a place designed to appear flawless, a theater of perfection staged for the emperor and the empire. Yet beneath its painted facades and polished rituals, cracks always began to show. The first whispers of trouble rarely announced themselves in shouts or clashes. They arrived quietly, like the faint crackle of fire before it consumed a house. A glance that lingered too long. A rumor carried on the wind, a piece of fruit left untouched because the color seemed off. The women lived in a state of anticipation, always sensing that disaster was approaching, but never knowing from which direction. It was said that the walls themselves seemed to listen. When one concubine, desperate for her family's survival, prayed too loudly for the emperor's favor, the eunuchs overheard. By morning she was gone. Her chambers stood locked. For weeks the silks removed, her belongings burned, her name forbidden. No one asked questions because to ask was to invite suspicion. Silence was the harem's shield, but it was also its weapon. The less that was spoken, the more fear could fill the void, and yet fear never stood alone. It was always accompanied by envy. Every gift from the emperor, no matter how small, marked the beginning of another woman's decline. A single hairpin bestowed upon one concubine could spark resentment across the palace. A smile at the wrong moment could ignite whispers that traveled like wildfire. For those who had nothing, every gesture of favor was an unbearable reminder of their invisibility. For those who had everything, it was a countdown to betrayal. The balance was impossible, for the harem was not built for harmony. It was built for conflict. It was here, in these first small fractures, that the truth of the system revealed itself. The emperor's harem was not just a prison of gold, it was an arena where survival was measured not in years but in nights, and where the smallest misstep could unravel an entire life. What began as subtle, almost invisible tensions would soon erupt into the open, dragging every woman into a storm of cruelty and despair that no silk curtain could conceal. Fear in the harem was not an accident, it was policy. The system thrived on silence, suspicion, and sacrifice. Every punishment was not just a consequence but a performance, a reminder to all who watched that no woman was safe. The cycle repeated itself with ruthless precision, and the palace walls became soaked with stories that were never written, yet never forgotten. When a concubine was accused of speaking ill of the empress, her fate was sealed before she could protest. She was dragged into the courtyard at dawn, her fine robes ripped away, her body beaten until she could not stand. No record mentioned her name again, yet every woman who witnessed her screams carried that memory like a brand on her soul. The lesson was clear. Loyalty was not enough. Silence was not enough. Obedience was not enough. Survival itself was a matter of chance. But punishment was not always loud. More often it was quiet, hidden beneath ritual. A woman might be served tea laced with something bitter. Her health would wither slowly, her beauty fading like a flower in winter. Another might be ordered to move into colder quarters, her servants taken away, her meals reduced. Slowly, isolation became as deadly as poison. These were fates designed not only to destroy but to erase. To vanish quietly was sometimes more terrifying than to die publicly, for it meant no trace of existence remained. The rivalries only deepened this cruelty. Women planted rumors, bribed eunuchs, sabotaged each other's clothing and cosmetics. A robe stitched with hidden thorns, a lamp placed just slightly too close to silk curtains, a whisper about disloyalty uttered in the right ear at the right moment. The emperor rarely investigated. He did not need to. The system itself encouraged betrayal. Every woman learned quickly that the downfall of another was the only ladder left to climb. And so, the harem became an endless cycle of fear. Each punishment fed new suspicion. Each disappearance silenced new voices. Each rivalry left deeper scars. What began as whispers grew into storms of cruelty, turning the palace of perfection into a labyrinth of shadows where survival was no longer about living. It was about enduring. The cycle of fear could not last forever without eruption. Small rivalries, whispered betrayals, and quiet punishments eventually built into something far more brutal. A spectacle of cruelty meant to remind every soul in the harem that they were powerless. It was during these moments that the illusion of beauty shattered completely, revealing the harem for what it truly was, a gilded cage soaked in blood and silence. One winter night, a favored concubine received an embroidered robe from the emperor himself, a symbol of his attention. For days she walked with her head high, her steps echoing with the rare pride of being chosen. But envy runs deeper than silk. Within weeks, another woman whispered poison into the ears of eunuchs, accusing the concubine of arrogance, of mocking the empress in private. No proof was needed. The accusation itself was enough. The robe that had once been her triumph became her death shroud. She was summoned before the court, her gifts stripped away, her body beaten until her screams vanished into the cold air. By morning, her chambers were empty, her name forbidden, her memory erased. The women who survived watched in silence, their faces unreadable, their thoughts locked away. Yet behind every calm expression was terror. If beauty could not save, if obedience could not save, if even the emperor's favor could not save, what hope was left? None. The harem was not a place where life was lived. It was a place where death waited patiently, dressed in gold. This was the breaking point. Every woman now understood that the walls were closing in, that survival was nothing more than borrowed time. Poison could be in the next cup. Betrayal could be in the next smile. The footsteps in the night could stop outside anyone's door. There was no safety, no loyalty, no escape. Only fear that grew sharper with every passing day. And so the harem descended into its darkest chapter. The palace that once seemed alive with lanterns and music now pulsed with silence. Every corridor felt haunted, every courtyard heavy with unseen ghosts. The women became shadows, moving quietly, waiting for the inevitable. What had begun as whispers had become screams hidden behind closed doors. The storm had arrived, and it would only grow darker from here. The harem was never simply a place of women's beauty. It was a machine of control, fueled by fear, designed with precision. Every rule, every ritual, every silence had a purpose: to strip away the humanity of those trapped inside. What outsiders believed to be a paradise of silks and lanterns was, in truth, an elaborate system of domination where women's lives were currency and their deaths merely a footnote in palace records. The emperor's power extended into every aspect of their existence. He decided who lived in warmth and who froze in shadowy corridors. He decided who bore children and who was forced into childless silence. A woman's worth was measured not by her mind or her soul, but by her ability to please, to submit, to remain silent. And when she failed, when her beauty faded, when her presence no longer served a purpose, she was discarded, not as a tragedy, but as routine. The cruelty was not only personal, it was political. By controlling the women, the emperor controlled the noble families who had offered their daughters. Every girl inside the harem represented alliances, loyalties, and rivalries beyond the palace walls. A smile could secure a family's fortune. A frown could destroy generations. Thus, the suffering of women became a weapon of the state, a tool of imperial strategy, cloaked in the illusion of divine order. Behind every death was not chaos, but intention. Poison carefully administered, accusations deliberately planted, exiles arranged so that families would never dare question the emperor's will. The harem was not a place of chance. It was a carefully designed labyrinth where suffering was the foundation of power itself. And in this machinery of control, the women were not simply victims, they were sacrifices, fed into an endless system that consumed their youth, their freedom, and ultimately their existence. The harem was built to shine on the outside, but its foundations were buried in shadows. For every woman whose name appeared in the records, praised for beauty, condemned for arrogance, there were countless others whose existence was deliberately erased. They entered the palace as daughters of noble houses, peasants gifted as tribute, or girls stolen from distant provinces, but they left as silence, as absence, as nothing. Unmarked graves were whispered of beyond the palace walls, hidden beneath lotus ponds and buried in gardens where the flowers bloomed unnaturally bright. It was said the earth itself held the memory of women who had once walked the corridors, whose laughter had once filled the courtyards, now reduced to bones beneath stone paths where emperors strolled without care. The empire's beauty was fed by this hidden graveyard, its glory polished with the suffering it silenced. And perhaps the most brutal truth of all was this: the harem's cruelty was not an accident of history, not the whim of one emperor or one dynasty. It was a system repeated across centuries, perfected through generations. Each new ruler inherited not just a palace, but a machine of suffering already oiled with the blood and tears of women before. Thousands of lives were consumed, their stories drowned under the weight of ritual, their pain deliberately buried so that the empire could shine untarnished in the pages of history. By the time the silks had faded, by the time the lanterns had gone dark, nothing remained of these women but shadows. They were promised paradise and given cages. They were adorned with jewels only to be silenced with poison. They were praised as emblems of beauty, even as their lives were erased. Their suffering was not a footnote, it was the foundation of imperial glory itself. And this is the truth the empire never wanted remembered: that behind every golden gate and jade wall, Behind every banquet and celebration lay the bones of women whose voices were stolen, whose futures were destroyed, and whose pain was buried. Beneath the mask of power, the story of China's imperial harems is not just history, it is a reminder. Behind the silk, the music, the glowing lanterns, there was silence. Behind every emperor's glory, there were women whose names were erased, whose suffering was hidden, whose very lives became invisible. The empire built monuments of jade and gold, but beneath them lay invisible graves. The world remembers the rulers, their victories, their dynasties, but it forgets the women who lived and died behind locked doors, their pain disguised as elegance. And perhaps that is the most brutal truth of all, that power often survives by silencing those who cannot speak. That history itself can be written to erase the very people who carried its weight. As you step away from this story, ask yourself, how many voices are still missing from the histories we celebrate today? How many sufferings remain buried behind masks of beauty and power? And what would the past truly look like if every shadow was finally allowed to speak?